So this is in the basement of MIT Media Lab in the late 1970s. It's an interface that they call Dataland. This is an Eames chair that this person is sitting in. That's Nicholas Negroponte. And they've designed this system which looks very much like some of the interfaces that we saw in the last talk. There's two touch screens, one on either side of the chair that they're sitting in, and then that's this big projection display which allows them to navigate information using touch. There's surround sound speakers so that you can play back sound. I've been kind of fascinated with this for the exact reasons that Eden described, and that is that a lot of what we do with data has its basis in these concepts of militarism. So this project was funded by the Navy, and there's a reason why it looks like a command center, is because that's exactly what it was meant to be. And when I was invited to come and give this talk, I have a little bit of a hesitation now speaking at visualization conferences because actually what I want to talk about is how I've somehow lost some faith in visualization, and part of that comes from this, in that as a data visualizer, what you are almost always doing is something like this. You're looking at a system that comes from the real world from afar. You're in orbit above this planet and you're looking down upon it. And my desires over the last few years have really been about trying to not go in the forward direction that usually comes from data visualization, but in the backward direction. So in other words, not taking a data set and trying to explain it, but rather finding a data set and trying to work backwards to find out where it came from and how we might engage with it in a more meaningful way. The caveat that I'll give you before I start is that none of this work I did by myself. So I have lots and lots and lots of collaborators. These are some of them from a studio that I ran in New York for 7 years called the Office for Creative Research. And so with that, this is a diagram that was made in the 1930s. It was made by a man named J.L. Moreno. He was a sociologist. He called this type of diagram a sociogram, and it's probably most well known because it's considered to be the first visualization of a social network. This is a 7th grade classroom, boys on the left, girls on the right, two brave vectors of puberty crossing the gap. And I love this diagram mainly because I can't help but think of how it would have been made, right? In the 30s, there was no other choice but to sit in this classroom. So whoever was collecting this data would have had to sit in that classroom, and they would not have ever been able to forget that those squares or those circles and triangles are humans. They're teenagers. They would know their names. They would have smelled their peculiar teenage smells. And so for them, this data would always remain to be human. If you fast forward to 2013, I woke up and read this story in September. The story came out of a research that had been done in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The people who did this study, a group of PhDs, they pulled 600,000 tweets from the Twitter API. They ran them through something called sentiment analysis, and they came up with a series of maps of New York City by emotion. This one is the happiness and sadness map. Bright blue are the places where the researchers said there was the most happiness. Purple are the places where there are the most sadness. What the researchers saw is that above Central Park, right above the reservoir, was the saddest place in New York City. So they did what any of us would do. They went to Google Maps and figured out what it was. And what it is what that location is in their data is a high school called Hunter College High School. And they went to the website of Hunter College High School and found out that they had just, when they had pulled this data, the students had just returned from spring break. So they had a good hypothesis, and so they published their paper, which got picked up by the New York Times. But I wondered, when I read that paper, did not have a very good high school experience. And I wondered what it must have felt like for those high school students to wake up in the morning and have the New York Times tell you that you're the saddest kids in the city. I tell you what, it wouldn't have made me happier, right? I wouldn't have thought, oh, that's great. And in fact, the story kind of becomes more hilarious. I call this a layer cake of bullshit because everything was wrong. First of all, sentiment analysis is mostly fraudulent, and Twitter is not the real world. But on top of that, they had made a mistake with their geocoding. So the location that they found on the map was not the location that they thought it was, but a place a few blocks away. And then to combine everything into I think the most important takeaway, I went to the high school to visit with the vice principal, and I asked her what she thought of the study, and she said immediately, without anything, said, we knew it was wrong. And I said, wow, why? I assumed she was going to say, because our students are happy, and we knew that this couldn't be true, but they were like, Twitter's for old people. That's what she said to me. Our students don't use Twitter. We know they're using social media, but we know they're not using Twitter. And so this is where we go wrong as data visualizers. Right? We use technology in ways that make mistakes. We don't understand that our actions can have implications on real people and their real lives. And we don't like to ask people questions. We don't like to talk to people. So the work that I've been doing over the last maybe 5 years has really been about the condition of living in data. What is it like for the average person, like those high school students, to live in data, and what can we do about it to make it better? That's the bottom line of the work that I've been thinking about. And so what these students learned was really one of the first answers to this question, which is that living in data sucks. And I mean that in a pejorative sense, but I also mean it in a vacuum cleaner sense. You're being extracted from at all times, and data is coming from you. One of my favorite quotes, this is Ursula Franklin. She is a Canadian, she was a Holocaust survivor. She became a Quaker. She is a metals and materials scientist and a very famous pacifist. And she wrote a series of lectures in 1989 that she gave to, as part of the Massey Lectures. They're Canada's biggest sort of academic honor. If you have a chance to listen to them or read them, they're revelatory. And in her talk, she says this thing, which I think is really important for us to always consider, is that this real world of technology, as she called it, this world that we live in, is not designed for our well-being. Right? And that's something, again, that these students at Hunter College High School understood right away, is that this condition of living in data is not designed for us. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit and walk through some work that I've done, I did years ago, which is in many ways complicit with the things that I'm talking about. So in 2009, I was on Twitter. I had just joined Twitter. And I was interested in the way that people would tell me things on Twitter. So one of the things that people would tell me was when they landed in an airplane. They wanted to show off, right, because they landed somewhere cool, and so they would tweet right away that they landed in that place. And so these tweets, they're not anything special, really. They're these quotidian moments, but I think what we didn't understand in 2009, and what I came to understand, was that these things, which once could not really have been considered to be data, really are data. So these people are telling me where and when they landed, and I can make a good guess as to where they are coming from because of their profile tells me. And so this is a project called Just Landed, where I took 36 hours of that data and plotted it on a map to try to show the types of things that we can extract from data which doesn't look like this, right? The data that is not a spreadsheet of latitude and longitude points, it's a list of tweets, but we can get this type of data from it. The sister project of that, which I did the next week, was a little more playful. This is called Good Morning. This is everybody around the world saying good morning in one 24-hour period in 12 languages all around the world. There wasn't a lot of people on Twitter in 2009, and there was a kind of conviviality about Twitter. So people would say, good morning, everyone. It was like a different, more innocent time, right? Before the Nazis fucked it up. And so what we're seeing here is we're seeing this thing which we know exists, right? There's nothing here that's going to shock anybody. Like, people wake up, we know that. But we're taking tweets that were not intended for this purpose and putting it into a data system in which we could see something different than what people had originally intended. Around the same time, well, a couple years later, these two researchers, Pete Worden and Alistair Allen, figured something out about the iDevices, the iPhone and the iPad, which was really shocking at the time. And that was that these devices were recording very precise records of your location, and they were storing them unsecurely in a known location. And so what that meant is that anybody who had access to your device, whether that be you or your partner or your boss, to either your phone or where you sync your phone, would get a file that would show you very, very clearly everywhere you've been since you owned your device. So each of these are location points when the authors did a drive up the eastern seaboard of the United States, so you can see the type of frequency of location that's being collected from that device. So this was a big privacy concern for obvious reasons. But for a group of us at the New York Times, it was also something else. It was the Apple had made a big mistake, and they had taken this data, which they usually guard and hold very close to their chest, and they had let it loose. And so we built a tool called OpenPaths, which allowed anybody to get that data from their device, upload it, store it securely and encrypted on our servers, so that they would actually be able to hold and view this data that they were never able previously to view. So OpenPaths is dead right now, but I'm happy to say that we're reviving it in a slightly different version right now. Brian House, the lead researcher on this project, is working on it. But the way that it worked for many, many years is that you would install an app on your phone, and like every other app on your phone, or most of them, it was taking your location data and sending it somewhere, but unlike every other app on your phone, you were where it was sending it to. And so, again, it would store that location data on our servers, encrypted, and you could come and visit anytime and get this kind of replay of your life. And I was skeptical when we were building it, because I was like, this is just me. Like, I know everything I did. I don't need to see it again. But there's something really rewarding about walking through these really, really detailed playbacks of your life. You get to see things that maybe you knew, but maybe you'd forgotten. You get to see patterns that exist that maybe you weren't already familiar with. And for us, this was an experiment in giving people something which is precious and I think rare, this idea of data ownership, this idea that we can actually hold our data in our own hands. And for me, it was about exploring what does it mean for an individual to have a personal relationship with data. This is something that I don't feel like we have, a personal relationship to our data, even though the data itself is very personal. So Brian wrote this little Python script which allowed him to take his OpenPaths data and extract what he called meaningful locations. And so the bigger the location is, the more meaning this location has. So this is where Brian lives. That's his office up in Manhattan. Also in this map was his girlfriend at the Times house, where he practiced with his band. If I took any of your phones and extracted this data from it, we would also likewise be able to find the places that are meaningful to you. And I think this word meaning is really important. We don't associate the word meaning to data, but data has meaning. Of course, it has meaning to advertisers. It means money, but it means something quite different to us. It holds the things that we do in our lives, the people that we love, the places that we live. I did something very different with my data. This is a year of my OpenPaths data. It's a little hard to see, but these are arrows, and so these are cardinal direction arrows, which means the ones that go up are me moving north, and the ones that go down are me moving south, and east and west, right and left. And it's arranged like a clock. So this is the morning. That's me going to work at the time. I went to work northwest. That's lunchtime. This is me getting off work. I had just moved to New York, so I never went home. And then you see some stumbling bits probably at the very end as I made my way back. And so the idea of this was I had this dream that this would sit above my bed and it would update every night, so that before I went to sleep, I could look at it and say, "Good night, data." And just remind myself that every day I'm generating these things that have meaning to me, that I should be able to see, and I should be able to hold, and I should be able to have ownership over. Part of the problem with this is that this is what the data looks like, right? This is hard for us to look at this and get emotional, right? But these 3 data points are really emotional data points for me. I lived in Vancouver for 27 years, and this is the moment I stepped off the airport or off the airplane in LaGuardia Airport. And later that evening, I went to this restaurant on Amsterdam Avenue, and I had this crisp glass of Riesling and this spicy Thai noodle dish, and I just was like, I'm in New York, like I did it. My partner and I have been together for 8.5 years. This is the moment that I met her. I walked to the end of the long hallway in my apartment building, and I opened the door, and there she was. And so these things they hold meaning for us. And it's natural for us to want to share this kind of evidence with people, but we have no mechanism to do it. I want to show these data points to my grandchildren one day, right? And say, this happened. We were real. We were there. And that's why you're here. And so my son was born almost 4 years ago. And so we're on our way to that grandchildren's story. And as a new parent, one of the things that was really evident to me in my very exhausted and somewhat hallucinatory state was this, that we're actually born as these data points, and we share these data points with these, like, I say 7 pounds 9 ounces because it gives it a sort of realness when I say that. I say that it was 4:58 p.m. because it gives it a realness, right? Data are evidence, and so we have this evidence of this thing happening that I shared with people. This is literally what I would share with people. I didn't say, when the kid was about 8 pounds and it was born in the afternoon. No, I said 7 pounds 9 ounces, 4:58 p.m. because the data gave it the evidence that I really wanted to ascribe to that moment. All right, what is it like to live in data? Well, I think one of the common things that we understand is that we are being used, and if we take the opposite of that we don't feel like we have agency in these systems. So how can we change that? And that a lot of the work that I did with the Office for Creative Research was around this. I had a really great student named Julia Irwin, and in my class at ITP, she made this really cool project. It's called Cookie Jar. And the way that the Cookie Jar works is that she collected some web advertisements from some of her friends, and then she sent them to strangers and asked them to tell her what her friends were like, just from their web advertisements. So the idea here was, could we kind of do the opposite of what advertisers are doing? Advertisers are trying to take your life and turn it into ads. Can we take those ads and turn it back into a life? At the time, I was working on a project which allowed me to collect every web ad that I saw. This is every web ad that I saw in a month. And I sent these ads to 10 people, and I paid them $10, inspired by Julia, to ask them about me. And what I found out was a lot of things. I found out that I was in my 30s, and that I was, or my 20s, and I played a lot of video games. I lived alone. I was obsessed with technology. None of these things I can say are true. So all the things that advertisements believed about me were not things that were actually true. And that was the foundational basis of, this one may be a little true, this was the foundational basis of the project that we built, which was called Floodwatch. And what Floodwatch allows you to do, or it did allow you to do, this is another project that's dormant right now, was to track every ad that you saw and to see how advertisers, what they thought about you. So you'd be able to see your advertising profile and then compare it to what other people using Floodwatch were seeing. So for example, what I saw is that I saw for whatever reason, I saw a lot of home and garden ads. I saw, I think, 58% more home and garden ads than everybody else, which is particularly strange because I have neither a home or a garden. And And so what we're trying to do with tools like this is to give people a sense of agency, right? So this idea that they can understand these systems that are acting on them, a way for them to listen to what's happening in their digital world, in their data world, and translate into something actionable. And when I say actionable, both this project and the last project have another component which I haven't spoken about yet, which is that they both have mechanisms to allow you to share this data securely with researchers. So for FloodWatch in particular, the reason why we started the project is that we know there is a lot of discriminatory practices happening in advertising, but we don't have a good way to get the data about it. So our idea with FloodWatch was that we would create the largest database of about targeting advertisement, and then instead of giving it to the advertisers, we would give it to people who are investigating these types of things. And so in doing so, the idea was that we could reinstill this idea of agency. Not every person I'm going to show you in my presentation today is an old Canadian lady, but almost all of them are. This is Jane Jacobs, who was born American and died Canadian. Some of you might know Jane Jacobs, a very famous urbanist, and in her book, her 1959 book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, she writes about one of the biggest failings in the way that we were designing cities is that there were no meaningful mechanisms for feedback. There were no good ways for people in the city to tell the people who were doing the city planning that things were not going right. And I would argue that we made this exact same mistake with the internet. The platforms that we built were not built such that there are meaningful ways for people to give feedback about what does it feel like to live in those places. So again, this idea of living with data is to be without agency. Another example of a project where we tried to think about what this type of agency could look like in the digital world is a project that I did in collaboration with a doctor named Will Dixon in the UK. He came up with this name. It's an awesome name. It's called Cloudy with a Chance of Pain. And what this project investigates is this thing that we kind of know about culturally, which is that there's a connection between pain and weather. But one of the things that I was surprised to find out when I met with Will Dixon the first time is that we don't know anything about this. There's no scientific backing either way about whether there's a connection between pain and weather. There's been a lot of studies done, but usually with small sample groups with not a lot of consistent data, and it goes back and forth as to whether people think there's a connection. So Will had always dreamed of this idea that he would build a project to explore this, and so what we did is we set out to recruit 1,000 UK chronic pain sufferers, and we would track them for a year. And I shouldn't say that we tracked them; they tracked themselves for a year using an app that we built that would allow them to report their severity of pain, their mood, all kinds of different things. And then they would also give us their location so that we could get really, really microclimate weather about what the conditions were like. It turns out chronic pain sufferers are people who want to be heard, so we ended up recruiting 13,000 chronic pain sufferers for the largest citizen medicine project ever. And for a year, a great number of those people did do this. They recorded their symptoms for an entire year, and then were able to tie them to weather. And we built a web interface where people could go and look at their data and see what was happening, how they were comparing with others. And the part that I loved the most was this interface that Ian Audouin-Foumat, who is the designer on this project, built, which allows people to not only explore their data, but to do something which is core to the word science, and that is to pose a hypothesis about their condition. So people could say, hey, I believe my pain is connected to weather, and I think that when the weather gets colder, my pain gets worse, and I think it happens within 2 days. And they could come back later and either validate that hypothesis or find out that they were wrong. So there's a paper about to be published, and I'm not allowed to tell you if there's a connection between pain and weather. I assume you're not going to break the embargo on that facial gesture. One of the core conditions of living in data that I think we're all familiar with, and the one that was mentioned in the very introduction to this event, is that there's a lot of complexity. And I think for most of us, this idea of living in data is to be overwhelmed with complexity. And therein is the kind of fundamental narrative of data visualization, right? That data visualization helps us with that complexity. One of the things that I've come to understand is that we speak a very rarefied language when we do data visualization. We are, in the most part, visualizing for people like ourselves. We're visualizing for people who have the same type of education as we do, that have the same type of numeracy that we do, that have the same type of mathematical skills that we do, the same type of technical skills that we do. But really, if we look at the problems that are facing the world, the people who probably need to understand or need to have a voice in these are people without those types of skills. So what we've been thinking about a lot over the last 5, 6, 7 years is how can we do different things with data? There's this idea that all of our data processes are back here, and then the only result of those is visualization. That's like the only way that we're gonna get that message forward. And we've been trying to think about vastly different ways that we might present data that have different types of cultural relevance. So this is a spreadsheet. Well, it's the CSV for a spreadsheet. It's the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art. 137,000 objects that are held in their collection. And we were asked by the museum to make an artwork from this. So what we do when we are presented with a data set like this is the same thing that data people always do, which is that we ask it questions. We query it. We try to find pattern in it. And so anybody who's ever written a database query knows how this works. And we do the same ideas, but our database queries tend to be a little bit weirder. So this is a query that I wrote right away when we were investigating this data. And what it does is it starts with a seed word, in this case girl, and it finds a title that contains girl. And then using some linguistic similarity code that I wrote, it tries to find another title that's similar to that but longer, and then another one similar to that but longer, and then another one, and so on and so on. So what you get are these kind of found poems from the collection. They read like poetry, and you can see, because there's some randomness, every time I run this code it's going to be a little bit different. And what I loved about these is they started to feel like I was kind of doing an introduction between pieces that maybe would not have otherwise met each other. Like here, I imagine these pieces in a room, and one of them is like, "Are you sleeping, girl? I'm young girl with braids." And it's like, "Oh, look over there, there's Francoise with a long neck." And these became the basis of some of the types of understanding that we wanted to get from the titles, which is something that we were particularly interested in from the catalog, because the titles encode something. They encode a lot about art history. They encode about the culture of the time, and so there's a lot of information in them. And we can do these types of exercises. We can do simpler things. Oh, there's some profanity on this slide. Sorry, I didn't give the warning. You can see what I'm searching for here. And again, when we talk about the titles, this is a particular point in art history where people were trying to be radical with the titles that they chose. Mark Hansen, who's a statistician that I work with a lot on some of the projects that I'm showing you here, asked a really simple question of the data, which was, what is the most popular first name of an artist who has work in the collection? And the most popular first name of an artist that has work in the collection is John. There are 200 of them. These are the most popular 4. These are the most popular 40. Give you a second to find Mary there over on the right. So here it was a real transition for us. We understood that what we wanted to do with this data was not to visualize it in a traditional way, but that what we wanted to do was to read it, and more specifically, we wanted to perform it. So we hooked up with an experimental theater group that we've collaborated with a lot called the Elevator Repair Service, and we built a series of 45-minute performances which happened in the galleries where we literally performed the data. And the rule that we had was that everything spoken by the actors would be verbatim from the database. So this is, in a really real way, a reading of the database. There's profanity in here again, sorry.
Ceramic jar, 2 bags, 1 in for Portage ship for George McMunus.
Is there a way to turn that volume up?
Sequel. Shut the fuck up.
Who's afraid of
Fuck
Virginia
the
Woolf?
CIA from the portfolio.
Prisca
Peace is
Von Mark.
patriotic.
What are you doing to prevent this?
So, motherfucker.
Hansen and Carmen Herrera, Magda von Markov and Jonathan Ives,
Fuck off.
Mary Lee Bendoff and Roy Lichtenstein,
Fucking freedom to
Julian
you.
Schnabel and Christian
title. Fuck the
Boltanski,
world.
Trenton Doyle Hancock and Roman Polanski, Emma Lou Davis and Henri Rousseau, Mary Jo Walters and Francois Truffaut, Theodore Rozak and Margaret and Norman,
Girl getting yelled at.
Sovak and Julia Lohman, John Baldessari and Bruno Latour, Andreas
Where's
Gursky
my
and
fucking
Amish
peanut?
Kapoor, Lena Dunham, Harold Tovish, Laurie Anderson, Susanna Solano, Paul Virilio, and Jean-Michel
So if you go online, you can watch the whole 45-minute performance, and you'll see that what we're doing is trying to take the data and sort it into patterns that give it some sense. And so what we really got from our theater director, John, who runs the elevator repair service, was this ability to turn data into dialogue. So the data became monologues, it became dialogues, it became these kind of group exercises. And in doing so, we were able to present pattern to people in a way that we're built to understand. We're built to parse dialogue. And so in doing these types of exercises, I think we were able to get people to understand data in a fundamental way that they would not have otherwise been able to understand it. And then the other thing, two other things we loved about that project was first the surprise. Nobody expects to have data sung at them. And so when you do it, it's disarming. It puts you into a place where you wouldn't normally otherwise be. And the second is that even though the gallery is a closed public space, it's a public space. And we're not used to running into data in public space. We're used to running into data in the New York Times, in a textbook, in our classroom, in these very, very curated spaces where our biases are already present. But when we do it in public space, which is what the rest of the work that I'm going to show you about, is something different happens. This is Manchester, and when I met Will Dixon about the Cloudy with a Chance of Pain project, I had two requirements, well, really just one, and that was that the data would be public. And Will said, no, it's going to be public. We have a website, and there's going to be, we'll give the data to researchers. I was like, no, Will, public. And what I meant is that we would put the data literally into the public space. So this is an installation we built for Manchester Day. It's a 50-foot long data walkway, which shows the same data that you saw on the earlier screens, but in a really physical sense. So there are two, you can see them a little bit in the edge. There are two curves about temperature and humidity, and then we have hundreds of patient records along the walkway. So you're allowed to walk, you're invited to walk along that walkway and make your own decisions about how these patterns may or may not exist. And what I loved about this is, again, it's in public space. It's not where you expect to see data, but this gives us another reason why data in public space can be interesting, and that is that it can be a social thing. People can experience this data not alone, but together in families or in groups. I love this photo. It's like my new definition of public data is if you can put a marching band underneath it, then it's public. So we had a chance a year later to put this idea into practice in the busiest public space in the world. So for a month, we had a data sculpture in the middle of Times Square. The data sculpture is called We Were Strangers Once Too, and it's a data sculpture about immigration. And it looks like a heart from the front, as you can see. From the back, what you see is that it's composed of the foreign-born population of the entire city. So we have these giant steel poles that are painted with every person who lives in the city that was not born in America. New York is special in that way. It has the largest foreign-born population of any city in the world, both by number and percentage. So it really is a city of people from elsewhere. And people would do the same thing with this piece. We saw it over and over and over again. They would find the country that they have a connection to and they would take a selfie in front of it. And I love this because I knew that not only were they sending their selfies to themselves, but they were sending them to their grandparents or to their parents who had come from these countries. And so what you got was this kind of performance. It really did become a performance where people would find these places and find themselves in them and send them to each other. We also had, I can't remember the actual number, but over 10 couples get married in front of our data visualization, which I think is a first. I'm not sure. I'll give you a little bit of a view of what it looks like.
This is the 9th annual Valentine's Heart, and it's particularly relevant that this year we are trying to send a message of love rather than hate, love rather than fear, which seem to be the themes of the day in so many different ways.
So the piece came out shortly after Trump's first failed Muslim ban, and so it got tons and tons and tons of attention. I'd built data visualizations before that had got a lot of attention on the internet, but this was shown in national news all over the world, and we were told that, this is a kind of weird number, but that it reached 1 billion media impressions, which meant that 1 billion people saw this piece, which is certainly better than anything I'd ever put on Vimeo before. The American sociologist Arlie Hochschild has spent a great deal of time in the American South trying to understand this condition in the country, where there is such a divide between the right and the left. And in an interview that she gave about that, she was asked what she thought could be done. And her answer comes down to a 2-word phrase, which is small bridges. And what we saw this piece very much was as a small bridge. This was not in the New York Times, which meant that people who watch Fox News would see it, and it was not on Fox News, which meant the people in who read the New York Times would see it. And it was in a communal space. That's why we have public spaces. This is what they're there for. And so we wanted to present a very complicated and a very contentious subject in a way that would be approachable by anybody, no matter what their biases are. Okay, switching gears. This is the Bow Glacier. It's in the Canadian Rockies. This photograph was taken in 1924. It flows down into a lake called the Bow Lake, which flows into a river called the Bow River. And the Bow River runs through the center of Calgary, which is a city in Canada. The river and the lakes are very famous. You've probably seen pictures of them. They have this turquoise color. The reason they're turquoise is because of something geologists call rock flour. It's literally pulverized mountain that's suspended in pulverized granite that's suspended in the water. And if you live in Calgary, you've been drinking this water your whole lives, and so in a very real way, your bones are made of the Bow Glacier. But most people have not seen the Bow Glacier. It's quite a ways away from the city. And so we were asked to build a public artwork in the center of Calgary, which, if you're not familiar with Calgary at all, which I'm sure you're not, Calgary is the Houston of Canada. It's the oil producing capital of the country. It's where all the oil company headquarters are. It's the center of the petroleum industry. And so what we did is we built this piece. We hiked up into the glacier and we installed a sensor station that's a permanent sensor station at the edge of the glacier. There it is. I think it's pretty well hidden. And what that sensor station does 24 hours a day is it sends data via satellite, via radio bridge and then by satellite down to a public square in the center of the city, where it's turned into light in this 20-foot by 20-foot LED sculpture, and maybe more interestingly into sound in a 16-channel surround sound system that is around the plaza outside. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of how it works. The speakers are hidden under benches, and as you walk through the plaza, you actually feel the sound wash over you. And in the springtime, right now, the glacier is beginning to melt. It's becoming very chatty, and so you'll hear lots of sound. In the wintertime, when it goes to sleep, you'll hear very little sound. But we built this project very much for the commuter who walks through that plaza every single day. And it's a way for them to be reminded that their existence in Calgary is dependent on this glacier. And that this glacier, even though is so far away and hard to get to, is in their bodies. And we're bringing it back to them through their ears and their eyes. the glacier is such an amazing place to be. And one of the things we were really trying to also do with this project was to create a dialogue between something that speaks at a very different pace to us and to the humans in the city. So the piece actually takes the glacier and then some data that we've collected from elsewhere in the city, pedestrian traffic in the plaza and car traffic around Calgary, and presents it as a kind of continuous dialogue that happens 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. We were asked to make sure that it runs for 40 years. It won't because of this. So this is 2 photos of the glacier taken 100 years apart. And the glacier will retreat past our listening system, we think probably in about 30 years. So whether they know it or not, in front of an oil and gas company, they will have a large silent artwork. One more project I'm going to show you, and then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for questions. This is a map of St. Louis, which is a city in the middle of America. This is a census dot map. The green dots are African Americans and the blue dots are white people. St. Louis is the most segregated city in America, and it's segregated along a very, very clear line. This is why, or one of the reasons why. These are called redlining maps. They were made in the 1930s. They were they were commissioned by the government after the sort of financial collapse that happened to explain who they were going to give money to refinance their homes. So what these groups were asked to do was to create maps of almost every American city to say which regions would people get money to be able to keep their homes and which ones wouldn't. And what we know now is that these were deliberately racist instruments. This was a way to remove black people from home ownership. It was on purpose, and it's had a very, very long legacy in this country, in America. And what it means is that the literal lines that were drawn still exist in these places, and they exist in conditions of poverty. I was very much inspired in this project, this is not St. Louis, by the way, by one thing that I saw from a presentation that a friend of mine named Patrick Meyer was given. He is a humanitarian worker, and he and a group of people, after an earthquake in Nepal, came and flew drones, and they created this really, really, really big map of the city. This was cool work, and I was like kind of half paying attention when he was showing this stuff because I'd seen some of his work before. But when he showed these pictures, I got really excited. And this was he brought these maps back in large scale and brought them to the community to be used as instruments for redesigning. So the community would decide how their cities were going to be rebuilt with these maps in hand. And so what we ended up building in St. Louis was this project called the Map Room. This is kind of what a map room looks like. They tend to be used at times of war or in city halls, in emergency situations, and they're almost always top down. They're ways for people in power to use maps to try to dictate how things are going to be fixed, right? And so we wanted to do the opposite of that, and so we took over an abandoned school in the north of St. Louis for 2 months, and we created a space in the gymnasium where anybody could come and author these 10-foot by 10-foot maps about their lived experience in the city. And then once they had created their maps, we would project civic data on top of those maps so that they could understand, first of all, how their lives were mirrored in civic data, where they could find themselves in civic data, but maybe more importantly, where they could not find themselves in civic data, where the civic data told a story that did not feel correct to them. It was an instrument for them to be critical of this data, because civic data kind of isn't mostly. It's something that is in the hands of city planners, often in the hands of entrepreneurs, but not often in the hands of people who live in communities. And so this was a social space where people could come together in groups of about a dozen to author these maps and then use them as ways to talk about data. The term that I use to describe this is that it was like talking over dinner, but talking over data. And we had lots and lots of different groups. This is my favorite group. They're called, they're a group of 9th graders from Brittany Woods School, which is a school in the north of the city. And they came and authored this map, which is of what they consider to be safe spaces in their neighborhood. I'll show you, this is them making the map. If you get anything out of this lecture, time lapse and ragtime, oh, they work so well together. So after they make their map, we had a facilitator in the space. Her name is Emily Catedral, and here's Emily leading them through a bunch of maps. And this map that you see overlaid is the same 1939 redlining map you saw earlier. And this blew the students' minds. This map blew the students' minds. And for one of the reasons is that they could see that redlining map in every other map. So here's the redlining map, and here's a map of employment. And so the almost exact pattern that was drawn in that time in 1939 is still evident. But for the students, this was not even it. One of the students came to me afterwards and said, when I walked to school in the morning, I crossed this kind of boundary that I'd never understood, where the sidewalks were nice and new, and then when I crossed that boundary, they're cracked and unkept. And she said, that boundary is that boundary from that 1939 redlining map. And the students went back to their school and they made a month-long project about these redlining maps. They put posters up in their neighborhood. And I always say that if our project, I spent 4.5 years and lots of my own money on this project, if it did nothing but get a group of 9th graders involved in community activism around racial inequity, then I'm happy with that. But we actually ended up doing a lot in St. Louis. So this is a quote from one of the papers that wrote about the project, about what the project does. This is the kind of note that we would get from teachers about how the project felt that it would have an ongoing impact on them and their lives, and the way that they were related to data, and the way that they related to data and art. And then in maybe the weirdest moment of my life, the mayor of St. Louis visited our space on the closing day and declared that day, which I can never remember the day, this is weird, I maybe have a brain problem. I think it's April 12th, official St. Louis Map Day. So if you need to go to St. Louis, you should go on Map Day. So what we're doing right now is moving the project into different cities. And so we are actively calling for cities everywhere to come and make map rooms, because we believe it's a really effective mechanism for people to understand about their lives through data. And it's something very, very different than people expect when you say come and learn about data. Okay, so let's summarize. What is it like to be living in data? It's not good. And that's something that I think we all know. These systems that we've built are not good. So what can we do about them? Well, there's some policy things we can think about. This is some work by Nathaniel Rabin. He was at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, and what they built was this kind of rights code around data. And I can send a link to this, but essentially they're saying that data rights should be human rights, and these rights are delineated in a very specific way. So these are the 5 data rights that they are very much advocating for. I work at New York City. Part of what I do is I'm a resident at the center called the AI Now Institute, which is focusing on data and artificial intelligence and how it's affecting society on a number of lines. And we regularly produce reports, which are really good for government and for anybody else who is working with data to understand the things that you should be thinking about. And then there's some grassroots organizations who are doing similar things. This is from a project called Our Data Lives, and they published this digital defense playbook, which is about tools and approaches that communities can use to strengthen themselves in the face of these corporations and powers that are not working on their behalf. But what do we need to do more broadly than that? Well, I would say that we need to do 4 things. One is that we need to think about data differently. We need to stop thinking about it as numbers. We need to start thinking about it as something that has meaning, that can have impact, that can have harm on people. And we need to start this in the classroom and the ways that we're talking to each other, so that we understand that this is not an inert thing. The data is not an inert thing. As designers, we need to design primarily for the well-being of the people from whom we're collecting data. That should be our first priority, is to understand in what ways could we possibly be harming people, and to really think about that in advance. This is a diagram you've probably seen a lot before, and I think this diagram encodes some of the problem. Because what this diagram suggests is that you can start with data and get to wisdom. But I would say that you cannot start with data without wisdom. We need to start with a consideration of what are the things that could go wrong before we start collecting large amounts of data as if it was something that is never going to have any impact. This is Teju Cole, not a white Canadian lady. He's a Nigerian-American artist, poet, and photographer. And this quote really encapsulates the next lesson, which is that when we are working with other people, we need to do our best to understand their complex, what he calls their complex sense of their own reality. So what this means in particular is to make sure that when we are working on data that involves communities, we have those communities involved. And then lastly, to dream of new ways that we can communicate data that don't just involve JavaScript and design tools, but involve things like performance in literature and visual art. Bring data into public spaces. This is, I think, tremendously important as we try to foster a dialogue about this really, really important issue. This is she's not Canadian either, see? This is Grace Lee Boggs. She was an American labor activist from Detroit. And I go back to her book, which she wrote just before she died, called The Next American Revolution. And the book is about how we might envision an America that is different than the one we live in right now. And what she comes down to is these ideas of participatory and place-based concepts of citizenship and democracy. And I read this quote over and over and over again when I think about what my work should be and what it should be doing over the coming years. Thank you.